mind movement disassociation reprocessing, or EMDR. While these are important and potentially valuable, I believe there is another opportunity for more imaginal practices. Thus, the purpose of this interpretative phenomenological analysis study was to carefully consider how engaging with episodic autobiographical memories as living images might reshape relationships with one's past, present, and future. Specifically, these memories were engaged as living images by adapting the dream work practice of dream tending in an approach that I refer to as memory tending. Before I go further, let me unpack some key terms and ideas, sharing some of the literature review that provided a strong foundation for the primary research of this study. Let's start with what is meant by episodic autobiographical memory. This is a fairly new concept in terms of language. Of course, the phenomenon itself is very old. It simply means a memory of a personal event. Psychologists Wheeler, Stuss, and Tolving described episodic memory as, quote, mental time travel and impossible without self-reflection. Psychologist Klein argued that only episodic memory, not learned memory, nor body memory, is true memory. For a memory is a memory insofar as the self is aware that it is reflecting upon itself. This idea of self is paramount to autobiographical memory as well. Conway and others refer to a working self that monitors its relationship to what they call the autobiographical knowledge base. The working self of a healthy individual selects and deselects bits of data from its knowledge base in order to recall memories that support the beliefs of the individual holds of him or herself. Further, episodic autobiographical memory describes the most specific level of autobiographical memory, which is also associated to vividness and manifests as mental images. For these reasons, I believed episodic autobiographical memory offered memory tending fertile soil for approaching a memory imaginatively. The methodology used for this study was IPA, which to begin accepts that what research participants reveal about their experiences is, quote, very tangible and very real. For this reason, it naturally accepts the participants' memory tending experiences are real. IPA's openness to the reality of experiences is possible in part because it applies an idiographic analysis to findings, meaning that individual versus generalizable meaningfulness is at the crux of the learning. Further, IPA holds a double hermeneutic stance towards phenomenology, where I, as the researcher, recognized my interpretations of the findings were in part informed by my own held biases, perspectives, and cultural influences. This double hermeneutic idea is actually of ethical importance to this study because some of the memories tended were of a traumatic original event. Carruth, a leading scholar on trauma, argued that in order to fully and authentically bear witness to a survivor's account of trauma, the witness must be willing, at least at some level, to be open to also experiencing the survivor's trauma by proxy. Thus, I, as the researcher, could not hold a bias toward what was learned in the interviews because I needed to be willing to allow myself to be fully available to the phenomenon experienced and articulated by my participants. So then, what do I mean by living memory? Before I was even able to define what is meant by living image, I had to begin to understand whether or not, living image, I had to begin by understanding whether or not a memory could be described as an image. This work of defining image for memory originated at the point of determining my theoretical approach. When I began my research, I thought it necessary to employ two lenses, phenomenology and imaginal. And yet, through my literature review, it became clear that the two approaches overlap. I thought of myself as quite clever to come up with the idea of phenomenology of the image, until it turns out the philosopher Bachelard coined the term long before it occurred to me, and the Dutch psychologist Sells used it as well. These scholars, as well as Jung, helped me craft a working definition of image. Jung used the term fantasy image to describe a non-hallucinatory image emerging from the unconscious. This is an important demarcation for this research, for to work with the images of our imagination, we need to feel safe and grounded. The distinction between these images and hallucination, as Jung described, is the full awareness that such images are not physically real, though they are psychically real. The definition I then used as image was an image as a psychic phenomenon, a phenomenon emerging from the psyche. Image is the what, as well as the how psyche communicates with ego consciousness. Phenomenology of the image, then, is an approach that practices attending to both the what of the image, as well as the how of experiencing the image. I'll come back to this in a moment. Etymologically, imagination is derived from the 14th century Middle English term imagiasno, which I probably totally blew that pronunciation, but I could not find a way to say it. It roughly translates as the ability of the mind to form and manipulate images. Thus, it's easy to connect image and imagination. What's more difficult is to connect memory to the imagination. I try to do so through the pathway of connecting memory to image. As far back as Aristotle and Augustine, memory and image have been intertwined. The Sufi scholar Corbin saw memory as an imaginative invitation toward the future. Freud worked memory as he worked dreams, investigating the images as pointing towards symbols of the material world. Jung appeared in his early works to hold the subject of memory at arm's length, referring to, quote, the abyss of memory, and describing it in ways that suggested he believed it was fixed and measurable. But in his memoir, he reflected upon it quite differently. Just after his break with Freud, he engaged a childhood memory in his first act of active imagination. Strikingly, he attributed this moment as the tipping point for all his profound theories regarding the psyche. What's more, he argued that, quote, every psychic process is an image and an imagining, and everything of which we are conscious is an image. In other words, image is the means by which psyche makes itself conscious. Thus, we might see that our memories are psychic phenomenon as revealed as images when we are made consciously aware of them. DiMaggio, a contemporary leading neuroscientist, also supports this theory. He argued that the brain makes maps of phenomenon, such as lived experience, and those maps are images. But these brain images are also maps, in a never-ending loop of the brain speaking to itself, and about its relationship to phenomenon. Thus, DiMaggio argued that a memory is not stored. Rather, the brain creates a formula for reconstructing an image of the memory. In other words, the image of an episodic autobiographical memory is not a perfect representation of the lived experience. It is a remembrance, a recreation using the brain's current perceptual material of what occurred in the past. DiMaggio, too, argued that imagination requires memory, that in turn requires psychic images that are also required by the imagination. Even from a neuroscientific perspective, memory, image, imagination, and the self are tightly woven. From just the few I have mentioned, as well as others, scholars have intimated or explicitly argued that memories are psychic images shaped and reshaped by ourself. The imagination is both responsible for the shaping and reshaping of memory, and likewise is itself formed and informed by memory. So let's return back to the idea of the living image. So as you recall, I have defined image as psychic phenomenon, the what as well as the how that the psyche communicates with ego consciousness. So then what do I mean by living image? What I am not saying is that it is physically real, but I am following Jung's lead when I say it is psychically real. It's tricky business to define something psychically real, but I leaned on the works of many scholars. To name three here, Jung describes such images as dynamic and autonomous. Hillman argued they are both part of us and beyond us, psychic phenomenon that moves us towards wholeness. Dr. Corbett argues that some images are numinous, where the intrapsychic image as embodied spirit is living because it is a manifestation of the divine made available in an image that holds the capacity to mediate the personal and the transpersonal. Through such interdependence, the soul is cultivated. Animated and autonomous, This numinous image has the agency to engage the self in a way that may have the greatest impact on the psyche of that individual. Thus, in summary, I argue that a living image of the psyche is interdependent with the self, who experiences the psychic image, whether through dream or memory. These images are mirrors of the psyche. Psychically real, they move of their own choice and from their own intelligence. Our receptivity to them as living images is in our simple acknowledgement that though they may touch, they extend well beyond, above, and below our ego consciousness. So now returning to my theoretical approach, the phenomenology of the image, that approach became the framework for attending the phenomenology of memory tending, where Jung, as well as the depth psychologist Watkins, argued on behalf of being the phenomenologist, especially of psychic material, who stays close to the phenomenon studied, carefully observing it without purposefully interpreting it. The philosopher Heidegger's and Jung's writings suggest ways to deepen such an approach, intimating there is a preparation that is required to allow ourselves, our egos, to sit in stillness and in waiting. In this waiting, that yields to openness, our egos shift to one of the observing ego that holds a phenomenological approach to the image. This mirrors what Eisenstadt laid out in his approach to dream tending. Dream tending is a practice of dream work that recognizes dream images as living and embodied. Dream tending extends concepts developed by Jung and Freud, where the dream is first met by the technique of association, and then amplification, and then an animation, moving us from the personal to the transpersonal, and then towards the imaginal. With care and respect, these psychic living images are engaged in a dialogue, whether that be spoken or unspoken. And in doing so, the dreamer may observe and interact with them, but never directs the images, for they are understood to be autonomous. They possess their own intrinsic purpose. These dream images are not interpreted, but met in a way that invites and accepts their presence alone may offer essential and extraordinary wisdom and healing for the dreamer, as well as perhaps other. Dream tending thus became my foundation for the approach of memory tending. Because I theorized that both dream and memory phenomena are psychic phenomena, I felt that one could work with memories in the same way that dreams may be approached, through association, and then amplification, and then animation, and with the same qualities espoused by Eisenstadt, to be fully present through the body, meeting the psychic images in their own way, and accepting that their wisdom will not necessarily follow or address any egoic or rational expectation. Thus, in my primary research, I interviewed 7 individuals, 6 whom I knew through my own dream tending work, and 1 who I did not know but was very close to one of the other participants. It was important that I worked with those familiar to dream work, specifically dream tending, because this research wasn't to determine if memory tending applies to everyone, but rather, could such an approach for the psychic material of memories, could such an approach work for the psychic material of memories in a meaningful way, at least for some? How, if at all, can we tend to memories as we do dreams? So following the method of IPA, I employed purposive sampling, by way of working with a closely defined group for whom the research question would be significant. I interviewed each participant in an initial 30 to 45-minute call to understand their background in dream tending, and then a 2 to 3 hour personal interview in which we tended a memory of their choice and then discussed the experience, and then a follow-up call about 2 weeks later to discuss any further experiences. I wish I had time to read all 7 case studies. Each was astonishing and inspiring to me, and each so very different. For the sake of time, I will briefly review one case. A dream tender introduced me to a 60-some-year-old man who used the pseudonym Rasputin. Though I first believe Rasputin had worked directly with dream tending, I later came to learn that he had not. This makes Rasputin different from all the other participants. He is also the only male represented. These differences contribute to the multifaceted value of his participation, extending the study, if ever so slightly, to those less well represented. Rasputin's was the only memory of its kind in this study. Rather than being of a single event, it was a memory of the same repeated event, performed again and again as a young child, no more than 4 or 5 years old, for what he guessed was the better part of 3 years. With astonishing detail, he described the surroundings of an environment intimately familiar to him more than 50 years ago. Quote, "It was a sunken living room. As you're standing in the front of the room, it's to the far left-hand corner. And there's a small piano. It's an upright. I think it was a Steinway Brown. And it was in the corner. But it was kitty corner. And the kitty corner creates a little triangle shape behind it. And so I would squeeze behind the piano and hang out there. The house has green shag carpeting and wood paneling. The piano, and there are these big wood dowels that are uniquely shaped, and they were for like when you move the piano, there's like a hold on it. And there was some kind of hand marking, like in black ink, that meant something to someone. And then I kind of remember some sort of label that is made from pressed metal that gets attached to an object. But I don't remember any words. I think there was a number on it, but I don't remember any words. And so I would go back there when I was sad or depressed and just hang out. But a couple of times I would be sad and depressed, and I would purposely go behind the piano to see if anyone really cared that I wasn't even around anymore. And then I remember sitting and being in certain positions behind the piano and hearing people go by, and I would make myself right. I would be like, you see, no one even notices that I'm not here. So that's the memory. The way in which he described the memory seems to foretell the tending experience. There is a devoid, but also quite moving quality in his soccer retelling. He later described the house as having a static feel to it, a fine description for the memory itself. It has little movement. It is unassuming and still. The memory's composure seems to express the inherent motivation of the teller to slip into the crevices of the household, to be absorbed by the wood paneling itself. An observer waiting to be observed. Further, he described squeezing himself into a, quote, little triangle shape, where the triangle may symbolize the urge to escape from extension into non-extension. Based on his description at the end of the interview, this symbolism is uncanny in the way that it is a mirror opposite of how Rasputin desires to be in the world. I asked Rasputin why the memory seemed to wish to be tended, and he expressed, quote, "It is an ongoing challenge for me to be seen. I have a predisposition to be more comfortable as a background player." He met my other clarifying questions with the short, unobtrusive response of, though he politely offered me more on the open-ended questions. I asked him what voices he recognized as he sat behind the piano, the voice of his mother being the only concrete recollection, the vagueness of the people, a notable juxtaposition to Rasputin's intimate recollection regarding the details of the small makeshift chamber in which he hid. "I remember," he said, "the dirt or the dust on the back of the piano. I remember the cords from the curtains. I think they were green, gold. They were kind of pushed into the side next to the piano. This environment suggests neglect, as if this outward physical setting, the triangular cell into which Rasputin squeezed himself countless times, mirrored the inner isolated and uncared for young self, a neglected self. The psychoanalyst music wrote about the unfortunate phenomenon that because the neglected child is likely to be so quiet and unassuming, the traumas of such neglect go unnoticed and therefore untreated. Even the therapist may have a difficult time addressing the child because the child is so cut off. There is a desire or even action taken on the part of the therapist to find excuses to not see the patient, where the patient's deadened state is uncomfortably palpable. The therapist's role is to meet the neglected child where he is, empathizing with his emptiness, in order to validate the child and to, quote, breathe life back into him. Before I move on, I need to acknowledge my lack of absolute proof that Rasputin suffered from childhood neglect. I am making this observation based on what he shared with me in the memory tending and follow-up interview. I began the tending by asking Rasputin to, quote, come back into the memory as though it is here, right now, end quote. I further invited him to be present to the memory images and to describe them to me as he saw them. Once again, his descriptions were so very detailed and yet so removed. Rather than describe the environment as a space in which he was engaged, he spoke as an outsider to what he observed in this very intimate and secluded place. He noted a, quote, kind of grief, congestion or restriction, end quote, in the chest. Somatically an area often related to grief, especially as a deficit in our personal relationships. When breathing into the chest, he saw an image of a long painting that existed in his childhood living room. The painting, as he described it, is, quote, long and drippy. It just feels long and dreary. Dreary. Dreary is a good word. Lots of shadow. Kind of heavy. He then sees the painting of a young Spanish girl who he later described as stoic. Stoic and stoic. Which is a little surprising considering she is relatively young. These images of dreariness and stoicism suggest projections of his inner world, an ill-defined and heavy environment that gives way to a child who represses his feelings. Rasputin's repetitive language used throughout suggests slow articulation characteristic of a neglected child, but also the importance of what is being expressed. If the environment is a reflection of Rasputin's inner self, it is static and lifeless. I asked Rasputin where he felt the static in his own body, to which he replied, in my legs and my feet. I don't feel inspired. Yeah, I don't feel inspired to go anywhere or do anything. Somatically, experiences of childhood neglect may be experienced as listlessness in the legs, unstable energy that drains from rather than supporting the body. In seeking something that Rasputin can engage, I ask him to touch the parts of the piano that he sees. In doing so, he seems to make a relationship with it, eventually engaging it in conversation. At first, he expresses envy for the piano. I find it amazing that you get so much attention, because everyone sits down and plays with you. Music noted that the detrimental effects that lack of play have on a neglected child can lead to the belief that the child, and later the adult, is an unworthy social partner. As Rasputin continues to engage with the piano, he hears the piano share, it's just as lonely for me. Yeah, it's just as lonely for me. I just sit here, waiting. Much like the empathy that music suggested is necessary in the relationship of therapist and neglected child. At this point, the conversation shifts. Rasputin begins to take some action, first by way of making himself comfortable in his triangular chamber, and then indicating a desire to come from behind the piano and walk away and not come back. When I suggest to him that he could do just that, because this is a memory image, he tells me he's not allowed. Eventually, he notices his father's wheelchair going by, and with encouragement from the piano, he squeezes himself from behind it and faces his dad, looking into his eyes. I see a little sadness in his eyes too, he says, and a lot of pain. He has more pain than I do. He has more pain than I do. It is as if a connection and a mutual sense of understanding is reached between them. Though he attempts an important discussion with his father, he begins to feel unstable. Noticing a tree outside, he crosses through a sliding glass door, and standing against the tree, spine to trunk, as if reinforcing his own backbone, Rasputin continues the conversation with his dad, eventually sharing that it felt more grounded. He didn't get mad or blow back, and I'm still standing. Words suggesting the childhood void of stability and the ability to stand up for himself has been filled. Before he leaves the memory image, one of the larger branches of the tree strokes his back. With this, he tells me he wants to retrieve some things from behind the piano. I want to read this passage verbatim. I'm just going to breathe them in. breathe in, I'm going to ask that it's okay to be comfortable. When I breathe in, I'm going to ask that it's okay to be seen. When I breathe in, I'm going to ask that it's okay to get what I want. I'm going to ask it's okay to speak my truth. It's okay to want to see and be seen. It's okay to want to be seen and be seen. It's okay to be seen. It's okay to be heard. And I'm breathing it in, that it's okay that I'm the one, that I can go out and I can create that. I don't have to wait for others. I can do it. And I want to include that I can walk down the street anytime I want. Anytime I want. With each mantra, Rasputin takes a deep breath, filling his lungs with what appears to be that life force that music spoke of. A sense of self that has not only the right, but the offered value to exist in and among others. It is as if Rasputin's words are a prayer with a movement towards something, an extension of the self. He closes the memory image with these words. And this time, I'm going to move the piano so I don't have to squeeze behind it. It is a simple, self-assured statement that requires no repeating, just resolute being. In Followup, Rasputin hoped to carry forward the experience by extending himself, the triangular cell of non-extension shifting into a shape of extension. We spoke 2 weeks later, and in those 2 weeks, Rasputin said he had cycled through feelings of empowerment and sadness. In this very authentic personal assessment, Rasputin reminded me that to work with oneself, potentially reshaping behaviors so well worn by the practice of repeating pattern, takes time. A one-time experience of memory tending may help us to understand ourselves and may offer us tools of where to go. But it is not a simple or quick resolution. Through the others I witnessed the value of bringing the older self to a memory of a childhood experience. The beauty of finding an ally in your younger self who has been where you are already. The importance of slowing down to enjoy the miracles of life in the moment and in the return trips through our memory. The ability to forgive our younger self and thus our current self. The opportunity to return to clear up unfinished business in order to move on from trauma. The mystery of communicating with someone behind the veil to find the healing necessary for those relationships that still remain. These participants suggested that dream tending and memory tending are quite similar, though in some ways memory tending is more flexible and in other ways more fixed. Regardless, like with dream images, memory images come forth as teachers and allies. Also, like with dream images, the body functions in a powerful way. Building on Dr. Trigg's work with memory, the places that exist as memory images are intimately intertwined with the body that has experienced its surroundings sensorially. These memories live within us, and our imaginal engagement with them may often come through the soma. The practice of memory tending, as with dream tending, requires a slowing down to fully experience the presence of the memory image, often in a multitude of sensorial ways. Through such slowing down, the images reveal their wisdom. And finally, like with dream tending, the ability to be witnessed, and even more so guided, comes through a level of trust with the tender that creates a validated space so that the participant may explore difficult psychic material, as well as be in touch with their somatic experiences. While I have spoken to the potential virtues of memory tending, it's important to acknowledge more work must be done to understand where and how this practice fits. This came to me clearly in Angeline's story of trauma, where the act of memory tending triggered old patterns of flight that, were she not aware of them, might have been detrimental to her own well-being, as well as the well-being of one of her important relationships. A final concern that surfaced is Rasputin's questioning, the validating of the original event, because of the imaginal work done with memory. The practice of memory tending is not to create doubt in the original events recalled, but rather to possibly see our memories as images that inform and are informed by the past self as well as the current self, and that may inform the future self. This research, at least to me, suggests that the practice may offer meaningful opportunities for self-learning, growth, and even healing. Perhaps then, just as the philosopher Casey intimated. Memory tending.